right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our third installment of Making AI Possible. Making AI Possible is brought to you by Caltech Center for Technology and Management Education. And we're very excited to bring a host of different courses for organizations and public individuals to learn about cutting edge AI, how it's used in business, and also bring in professors, research staff, and industry professionals. Today, I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Richard Anderson from the Los Angeles Dodgers. Dr. Anderson brings in a wealth of knowledge, be it from sabermetrics or causal inference at different organizations, primarily baseball. Has a PhD from political science from the University of Michigan and an undergrad in the same subject from the University of Washington. Dr. Anderson, I'm just going to let you kick it off by a little introduction about yourself and then take us out to the ball game here.
All right. Thanks for having me. So right now my title is Director of Quantitative Analysis at the Los Angeles Dodgers. So that is the core data science team inside of our baseball operations department. So as you mentioned, got my bachelor's degree at University of Washington. I grew up in Seattle. I was a big Mariners fan growing up. Then went to Michigan to get a PhD in political science. After that, made a big transition. My first job coming out of grad school was with the Los Angeles Angels. So I was the first full-time analyst hired at the Angels, helped build out the kind of the initial version of the data science team there. I spent 5 years with the Angels. I then spent one season with the Cincinnati Reds, managing their data science department. Uh, After that, I spent a year at HBO Max, and eventually we all got merged into Warner Brothers Discovery on the data science team, focused on causal inference and experimentation. And then about 3 years ago, the Dodgers poached me back into baseball.
Excellent. Now, when I was looking through your profile, I read some of your papers and highlights throughout your career. You studied political science for quite a long time, and you don't see the B. Having full disclosure, I was a political science undergrad too, so I tend to defend the craft. But there's certain elements of political science that make really, really good data scientists and analysts. Can you talk about some of the interesting things that you did in your research to lead you to have that skill set today?
Yeah, I think the things that I did in my research that helped me initially get the job was I was working with text data. So the primary source of data from my dissertation was the texts of congressional hearings, and those are big and unruly. And my task was to kind of turn those into data and use tools from the kind of nascent world of text analysis um, in machine learning to try to learn things from all of that text. And so I think the general practice of having to build a large data set, decide what the data was that we even needed to collect, and then just being very careful about what kind of claims can I actually make from the data that I'm using. And I really think that skill is probably the most helpful one in the position that I'm in now. I think when you're coming from a social science background, you're in a world where most of the time you are not able to do some kind of experimental manipulation. And obviously, there's a lot of work in political science that is experimental, a lot of work in economics. And there's been this big kind of causal inference revolution where people are trying to identify, sources of random variation out in the world so that you can make causal claims. Uh, but most of the time, you do have to work with observational data, and you have to think hard about the process that generated your data if you want to claim to be learning something,
Mm.
or even if you want to just diagnose something in a model you're making. You're saying, I'm getting this behavior that I don't understand. And I think that the political science education gave me the tools to go, okay, can I come up with two or three explanations, come up with testable implications so that I can work through what might be going on here, and then I can work that back into my model to try and adjust for whatever context I'm missing or whatever kind of selection bias that I didn't recognize on the
Right.
front end. So really
So walk
thinking really hard about research design is a thing that you have to get good at coming from a social science background.
Okay, now talking about research design. When you are an analyst, when you are a senior data scientist, when you're running a data science team now, in professional baseball, how do you lay out that type of analysis?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Yeah, so I'm kind of going for like, what is the day in the life of an analytic workflow? If you're working on something where you're trying to find justification of, we did treatment Y and it, landed on X result. How do you create such an experiment in professional baseball?
We have very little ability to do experiments in professional baseball.
Is
I
there a
would say
lot of
that
noise?
pretty much all of our work is observational. I mean, uh, we have players in our minor league system, and we're able to ask them to try new things. But when we're working with our minor league players, we're in kind of a small N world where yes, we can run experiments. We can only realistically detect treatment effects if the effect is huge. And most of the time when the treatment effect is huge, you're probably not saying something that was that interesting in the first place.
Yeah,
So we
it
might be
kind
able
of
to manipulate, like, what if we gave them all the worst diet imaginable? And yeah, that would probably affect their performance, but we probably wouldn't learn that much.
there's probably
So I think for us,
no spiking the punch bowl in the clubhouse
right.
to for a treatment. Okay.
So I think what we end up dealing with more is um, just trying to identify all of these selection biases that come up in analyzing data that's coming from baseball games. So you could think about something as simple as like uh, um, we want to see how a player's ability to manipulate pitches or locate pitches evolves through the game. Um, what you might see is that, hey, these guys who stay in for a long time, they actually don't lose anything in what we would call stuff or their ability to locate pitches. And you could draw the conclusion that, like, okay, well, the line doesn't go down, so pitchers can just continue a level of performance to 150, 200 pitches, and they'll never get worse. And of course, that whole thing is just selection bias, right? The players who get to stay in for 100 pitches are the players who are performing well, right? So when you try to extrapolate that line, you're just learning from the bias. And so at that point, you have to go back and really try to understand, like, what is the actual process that's generating my data, and then how can I build that into my models?
So when we're talking, it sounds like there's a lot of elements of behavioral economics, econometrics, political science. That's an amalgamation of essentially the job that you have today.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. It is a lot of the same skills just applied in a very different area. I think the
Yeah.
things that the academic background focused more on were, you know, precise identification of coefficient estimates and that kind of scientific uh, journal sort of work where yeah, again, you're building statistical models because you want to estimate a coefficient because you want to understand some treatment. And we do less of that, but it's the same thought process that has to inform all of it, right?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, our data is not such that we can just chuck it into, whatever the best performing black box is and then make decisions based on what comes out.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm glad you brought that up. Let's talk data. What types of data sources are you using now, and what did that look like 20 years ago?
Yeah, so I'll start with 20 years ago. I mean, and I guess going back before that, it was hobbyists who had to collect their own data, and uh, they could watch video, like whatever video they could get their hands on, whatever records they could get their hands on to kind of recreate what the game state was at any given time, and say what the events were. So was there a home run? Was there a single? Was there a double? This is the Retro Sheet project that was the foundation for a lot of early work in what was called sabermetrics, but it's effectively box scores and then into some play-by-play data. So a lot of the early work was using that kind of information to answer questions about, what are the things that players do that actually add value? So you get a lot of the kind of what we might call early Moneyball kinds of
Mm.
findings, where it's really valuable to get on base. It's really valuable to hit for power. Teams were probably overvaluing, RBIs and batting average. About 20 years ago, MLB introduced the first pitch tracking system. It was called PitchFX. And so if you like, watch a game on TV and you get to see the box and like, where the pitch enters the box, it's all powered. I mean, it's not powered by that system anymore, but it all comes from these kinds of systems that still exist in MLB stadiums where we are tracking the pitch over the full course of its trajectory. And even putting aside the tracking of the tracking of pitch characteristics and where the pitch landed in the zone, this is the first time we actually got pitch level outcomes. So before you could say this pitcher is getting a lot of strikeouts, this pitcher is not allowing runs. And around 2006, this is the first time you start getting data where you can say this guy's fastball gets a lot of swing and miss. This guy's curveball is not performing the way we expect it to perform. And so with that data, you start to be able to answer kind of more interesting baseball questions, more fine-grained baseball questions. Um, and then the data that was collected on top of those pitch level results was information about how the pitch was moving as it's going towards home plate. So how much horizontal break is there? How much vertical break is there? How can we describe the shape of a fastball or a curveball? Um, and you can imagine that once you have information about the outcomes of every pitch, and you have information about the kind of inputs, right? How the pitch is moving, where it's located, you can start to learn things that you couldn't learn before about pitch profiles that are more or less effective than we had previously recognized. I think one thing that came out of that was a de-emphasis, I guess an emphasis on certain fastball shapes and a de-emphasis on certain curveball shapes. The big, bendy, slow curveball that's so aesthetically pleasing and looks awesome when it works it was not as effective of a pitch as people thought. You also, if you know where the ball was located, you can start to form an expectation about whether that pitch is going to be called a strike. And that gives rise to the study of catcher framing, which is the ability to basically fool the umpire into calling strikes when the ball was outside of the strike zone, or conversely, being able to avoid losing strikes on balls that are inside the strike zone. And that completely changed the way we think about catcher value. It turns out there is an enormous amount of value in being able to steal a couple of strikes per game. And so the league came to sort of emphasize framing as a core catcher skill, whereas before it really was more of like a catch and throw. Can you throw out base stealers? About 10 years later, TrackMan introduces, I guess PitchFX had introduced some of this too, but it becomes widespread with TrackMan around 2015, 2016. We started getting data about how the ball leaves the bat for the first
Right.
time.
And for those unfamiliar with TrackMan on the podcast, I know you and I had a long discussion about TrackMan. We talked about how it's used in golf and PGA Tour telecast, how it's used in MLB telecast. Can you kind of give a very basic overview of what the TrackMan and adjacent technology is about?
Sure. It's really just about tracking objects on the field. So in golf, that might be the ball. In baseball, that's the ball. I mean, it really is just primarily the ball. So how the ball is moving through space at any given point in time. So you'll see, again, there have been different systems over the years, some camera-based, some radar-based, but it's all this same idea of we want to be able to see the ball when it leaves the pitcher's hand. We want to be able to determine where the pitch was at any given time. We want to have some representation of the trajectory of the pitch. And then in 2015 or so, we data about like the ball leaving the bat became widely available.
So on 2015 to today, about 10 years, have there been any technologies breakthroughs that you've seen that have kind of changed the how you go about doing analysis or data preparation?
Yeah, the world we're in now is we're getting uh, very high frame rate data on um, on players' limbs, on how
Mm.
players are moving. So over the course of a pitcher's throw, like what are different points on their body doing, from when they start their windup to when they release the ball? Like what does the path of a bat look like as a player is swinging? And MLB has started to make some of these metrics available to the public, uh, but the public doesn't get the raw data that we get, where it's 300 frames per second, roughly 30 points on the player's body.
There's no GitHub repo for that publicly
There
available.
there is no GitHub repo available for that.
Now, I just want to take a second. I'm looking through our participant list, and I recognize some names who have actually played a role in professional and Major League Baseball throughout their careers. So I'd love for folks to put questions in the Q&A. I'll try to pepper them in throughout this talk that Dr. Anderson are having. And so if not, we'll get to them at the very end. So we talked about kind of the different sensors, be it biomechanical, be it TrackMan for different radar detection. Talk about kind of what your day to day looks like. So you have this tremendous wealth of data sources, proprietary data sources, and like if I would just personally have a problem as like the blank page, probably how do you prioritize what you're going to work on throughout this day?
Yeah, so I organize our projects into three primary areas. The first is player evaluation. So it's using data to quantify some skill. So that could be, I mean, you can imagine we want to quantify fielding, we want to quantify base running, we want to quantify hitting, we want to quantify different aspects of pitching. And then the larger endpoint there is we want to run all of those through some kind of forecasting process to be able to say, here's how good we think this player is going to be today, a year from now, 5 years from now, because we need to be able to service the president of baseball ops and the general manager who have to make trade decisions or contract decisions on those kinds of timelines. So we're coming up to the trade deadline and we're going to have to make decisions about should we trade this minor league player for immediate major league team help. So that's kind of area one. And I would say that's where my group spends most of our time right now. Um, Area two is you might call it player deployment, so on-field strategy, and these are things that this is an area that's gotten a good amount of publicity. Things like the shift, things like
That was my next question. You must have read
pulling,
off my sheet.
yeah, pulling a pitcher the third time through the order. All of these kinds of strategic advancements come from at their heart some kind of predictive model of how baseball works, right? If you can think about, coaches can very reasonably ask the question, where do we want to put our fielders? Implicitly, there's a question of, okay, where do we think the ball is going to go, given all the information we have? And then how do we optimize on top of that? So that's kind of the second area, and that's servicing our major league coaching staff primarily. And then the third area is player development, right? How can we say things about what makes players better or worse? What are players not doing that they should be doing? So if you're like, we're starting day one of a homestand right now, the kinds of questions that we might get are, we provide tools to identify advantageous like pitching or pinch hitting kinds of matchups, like substitution decisions in the game. We'll get a lot of questions about, hey, are we sure about this one? Do we feel good about how we valued this player? Do we think we're properly weighting how good he's looked lately or how bad he's looked lately? This player has a lingering injury. How do we think about layering that on top? A lot of questions like that are, the same sort of thing, just making sure that our coaches feel as comfortable as they can with the decisions we're asking them to make.
Yeah. Speaking of, you've talked a lot about coaches here and kind of from more of a nascent view of when I think of, baseball analytics, I think of the scene from Moneyball where everybody's looking around the conference table, you have Billy Beane of the Oakland A's, and he's trying to show that this type of analytics system is going to provide the best strategy for the players. And you have a kind of all the old time traveling coaches saying, no, I've been gut feeling, kind of like how organizations always say, we've always done it this way. And that's kind of like, that's the mountain that you need to climb when they say that. So how do you go about convincing folks who said, we've always done it this way, or this is the gut feeling that we've always had wins based off of? How do you change that strategy?
Yeah, I think you have to be very respectful of people who have spent their lives in baseball and have accumulated a mountain of knowledge and frankly thought about a lot of these things harder than we ever have. I think there's a temptation to say that we have data, therefore we can come up with the right answer. But as we alluded to earlier, oftentimes we're not even sure the questions we should be asking, or we haven't thought hard enough about um, something that's producing the data that we're looking at that might invalidate a recommendation. Um, not that we would provide this recommendation, but uh, slow runners tend to be pretty effective base stealers because they only run when nobody's expecting it, right? So I worked at the Angels. We would see a lot of like Albert Pujols stolen bases where he was
Mm.
halfway to second base by the time the pitcher released the ball because the pitcher wasn't paying attention to him. If we were to go down to the coaches and say, all right, we think Albert should be just stealing a ton. Like they would rightfully say, no, you can't do that.
Mm.
That would be bad strategy. And so I think just hearing them out, really investing in getting the kind of knowledge that they have and trying to uh, take their concerns seriously. Say, we've looked into as many of these things as we can, and here's the conclusion that we have.
Mm.
Um,
What's the communication like in Major League Baseball with your quant and data science team? Is it a live, you know, you kind of have a microphone feed into the ear, or you call up the box? Like the way I have thinking about it is like maybe you have a box and it's like NFL where you're calling in plays, or is it a pre or post game strategy? I don't want you to give away too much, inside baseball information here. I want to respect proprietary info, but what's the general view of how you get that information to the coaches?
Yeah, so it all has to be done pre-game. We cannot communicate with them during the game. I mean, we've had a couple of technology and baseball scandals over the past few years, but the really pertinent one here is the Red Sox got in a little bit of trouble for communicating through Apple Watches. And so there are monitors from MLB. We are allowed to put information on an iPad, but that's it. Like nobody's talking to the coaching staff during the game. Um, so yeah, it might be before a series. There's people getting together to kind of plan out, what bullpen usage is going to look like, or hey, this run of hitters in the San Diego lineup, we think this is a really good sequence of relievers to go after them in certain game states.
And so, this information that you're giving to the coaches beforehand, what percentage of that data would you say is offense versus defense related?
I think it's more defense and pitching because those are the things we have more control over. Offense is sort of necessarily reactive. And so what we can give information about, this pitcher throws this pitch type and like you can give some sense of how a player might be attacked, but ultimately it is reactive. Where there's pitching, you're controlling the flow of the game. So there's a lot more room to talk about strategy.
Is it so thinking of new ways to collect data, new ways to feed more strategy to the coaches? Is there any talk in MLB about wearable devices or new ways to collect information? You talked about limb tracking. Is it only video? Are we going to see players in 10 years wearing, devices in their helmets and in their shoes?
We are not going to see that. That's explicitly in the collective bargaining agreement that
Uh,
major league players have to consent to sharing data. And I think
hmm,
there's changing rules and norms around what players, what devices players want to be wearing to collect data from, but we are not allowed to access it without their permission. So, yeah, I mean, we joked in the office about like, what if we were able to do infrared cameras so we could see, a player's body temperature and we could see if they're nervous and see if if they're gonna fold in the clutch or whatever it is. But that is very much not allowed.
I know there's a lot of golf exhibitions where they've put heart rate monitors. I think Capital One's the match. They did that a lot. And you see nerves and from a fan perspective, that was really cool to see. But I can see from a collective bargaining agreement how that might be an issue.
Yeah.
Now, in
Yeah,
terms of
players are rightly nervous about how data uh, might be used against them when it comes time to sign a contract.
yeah, in terms of data that you're collecting, is any of that data shared to MLB at large, or is it all kept within each clubhouse?
Most of the data is shared. So anything that's happening in a game, is shared. There are, um, you can have a pitcher do like practice sessions, and that's proprietary. But any kind of, yeah, anything we're collecting in game gets shared with all the other teams. And there are different technologies that teams do or don't buy. And if you are purchasing that technology, then you come to some sharing agreement with the other teams that are also purchasing that technology. Like we could opt out if we wanted. We could say
Mm.
we don't want to share this information. But generally, there's the expectation is you are going to share because you want to get that information from the other teams as well.
Kind of one last question about the analytics process.
Mhm.
You mentioned that there are new things like framing for catchers that you start seeing as being important. What's the lag period that say maybe you might say, hey, this statistic is really, really important. This is something that we're going to track. And then I'm thinking of, the kids in high school or middle school go, gosh, like if I'm a catcher, maybe I should start practicing framing. Do we start seeing that in the minor leagues 8 years down the road? Or how long does it take for one of your discoveries to be seen kind of in the bullpen as a quality?
I think the lag time is getting shorter and shorter. I think there's a really robust public research community that's sharing knowledge about what's important from the kinds of metrics that
Mm,
we're also calculating internally. And then there's also been a proliferation of what we might call like data-driven training centers who are helping train players with data. Driveline Baseball is the most famous one, and they've done an incredible job working data into the training process, and such that I think players now are, if there's a new if there's a new pitch shape that someone has been
mm.
messing with, like that works its way down very, very quickly. It seems like every offseason there's a discussion of what the hot new pitch shape is, and it really
Yeah.
is like someone tinkered in the major leagues or the minor leagues, and people heard about it, and everyone's sharing it online, and so yeah, there's very little lag.
Mm. So let's bring the conversation kind of to businesses and organizations and what they can learn from your discoveries and your work products is something that we see a lot in machine learning, AI, or data science shops is this kind of POC purgatory, this proof of concept, where you work on it a long time, but you never really get to say the business adopting it moving to production, or maybe a coach implementing it. How do you move these, what you would consider a very valuable data science product, to the organization accepting it and adopting it?
Yeah, that's a really tough process. Um, a lot of it is being very intentional about rollout, being very intentional about coaching users about, here's why we think this adds value. Here's the evidence that it's adding value. Here's where you're going to see it
Mm.
downstream. And then just doing basically seminars where we'll sit down with people and try to give them as much information as they need or as much information as they want. There's certain users who are going to be more technical than others and really want to get into the weeds and just try to be explicit about here's what this does, here's what it doesn't do, and let people ask questions, take those questions in on our end and do our best to answer them down the road. I think if you just present if you present a product and people have very reasonable questions like, hey, you're asking me to change the way I've made decisions for a long time. It's very reasonable for them to want extraordinary evidence. And if you want people to adopt that, then that's just where you're going to have
Yeah.
to meet them. It's not
So
it's not fun, and it's always frustrating um, answering these questions, but it's so important. It's the best thing you could spend your time doing is really trying to get your end users to understand where the value is.
yeah, and I imagine your craft and your industry is much more difficult to show value. If you think of a business, say, okay, we made X amount of dollars last year, we made X amount of dollars this year plus $1. Great, incremental change. For you, it's a zero or one. It's either you won the game or you didn't. So how do
Mhm.
you show incremental value if you lose the game? That must be a very difficult challenge to overcome.
Yeah, it is. I think there is an appreciation in baseball that some things are just kind of fundamentally random, and there's not much you can do about them. Like if one of our pitchers comes in and throws the pitches that everyone agreed that they should be throwing, and there was, a bloop single that fell between the first baseman and the right fielder, and a couple of seeing eye ground balls, and then uh, you know, and I don't know, so something else happens to score a run.
Mm.
We, I think at this point the industry is pretty good about not beating itself up too much over that. If there's nothing you really did wrong, the pitcher executed the game plan, the batted ball quality itself was low, we'll say like, yeah, that's fundamentally baseball. I do think there are places though where it is a little bit easier to evaluate ourselves. And again, you're never going to overcome all of the randomness that happens in baseball, but things like how well do we develop our players? Are we like given where we're drafting and the kind of bonus money that we have available, are we seeing a larger than expected return on those draftees? How well are we doing? I mean, evaluating ourselves on the players we signed, but also the players we didn't sign. Like how good were our forecasts on these players? And so we're kind of constantly evaluating ourselves there as well. Like, oh wow, glad our model said this player was bad and we didn't sign him and he signed somewhere else for a big contract. Like that's a win. That's a huge win for us.
So even though it doesn't show a win on your ledger, it's still for your data science and quant team considered as moving forward.
Absolutely.
Hmm. Are there any critical success factors in the beginning of the year? Like I'm thinking folks in industry might meet with their manager and say, okay, these are the three things that I'm going to get essentially get evaluated on. As a department, you're leading this team. Are you being evaluated on specific factors each year? And does that change throughout the year?
Yeah, I think we're being evaluated on the progress of different projects, and it kind of ebbs and flows who our primary stakeholders are going to be and what they're looking for. But yes, we'll be told these are the primary department priorities for the year, and of course we have a voice in that. Like a lot of my job is to say what I think the department priorities should be and where we're in a position to add value, and so it's a collaborative process, but out of that comes some understanding that like these are the items that we really want to make progress on in the short and medium term. And yeah, that can, I mean, to a large extent, it changes based on the baseball calendar, right? If you are
Yeah.
working on a project that is aimed at the amateur draft, right? Our draft is in 2 weeks. If we have a project that at this point we recognize is not going to be done in time for the draft, it probably doesn't make sense to
Mm.
allocate time there at the end of July when the next draft is 11 and a half months away versus, time spent on something more pressing. And then we can always
Yeah.
come back to the draft later.
Last month, we had Dr. Leslie Fine, who's a game theory economist, who got her PhD at Caltech, and she talks specifically in how she helps founders draft essentially a quitting criteria before they even go in.
Mhm.
Are there certain benchmarks you say, okay, if this strategy is not working by July, we'll pivot to this strategy? Or is it kind of in the moment decisions that you make, say, okay, well, maybe we'll give it another week since we've invested so much in this?
It's more the latter. I don't think we always have a clear quitting criteria, though that sounds very valuable. I'd love to talk to her about that. But yeah, it's a lot of, okay, we've invested time in this project. We started this project because we thought it was potentially valuable. What are we seeing at this point, given what we've tried? Like, do we believe that there is a reasonable set of next steps to take that have promise, or have we like, mostly tested the things that we think have a chance to really move this project along? And if you're to the point where you're saying like, well, we've tried our, three highest impact items to really nudge this thing along and nothing's taken, at that point, unfortunately might have to cut bait with the project.
While you're talking, I went ahead and put in the link for Dr. Fine for her talk on how to kind of guide startups through some game theory and behavioral economist expertise. So for listeners, there's that. So you spend a lot of time hiring, mentoring, searching for talent. what type of talent are you looking to bring into your team? And what can folks who might be a junior data scientist or a fresh political science grad who's looking to gain more technical tools? What's some of your advice for how to work in an organization like on your team?
Yeah, I think the so when we're hiring, we're trying to ask ourselves, can this person be an excellent baseball researcher? You know, can they use data to generate new and novel findings or build decision-making tools? Um, and the easiest way to demonstrate that you can be an excellent researcher is to have done research. And this could be, you know, a thesis. This could be more often than not, though, it's going to be a personal project. It could be contributing to something open source, right? It's that demonstration that you know how to take a project from beginning to end and produce something that you're ready to talk about, that you're passionate about, is it's an incredibly valuable signal in the hiring process. In terms of technical skills, like we're looking for people who are, you know, experts in either statistics or ML. We're looking for people who are excellent programmers. I think that's a thing that I've come to appreciate more and more as kind of data science code bases get larger and everything gets harder to maintain. You need people who really fundamentally uh, understand how to code. Like that will just it will never go out of style. You know, it's always going to be a good thing to look at someone's GitHub page and see just a really well organized repo with like really good code reuse. Like that gets me jazzed and makes me think like, this person has a core skill that we're going to need them to develop.
I really like how you talk about outside projects because whenever I've been hiring for teams that I've worked on, one of the questions I've always asked in an interview is, what have your passion projects been? And, you know, obviously someone who's very successful in their own career, what were your passion projects?
Yeah, I mean, my passion projects were kind of one-off pieces of baseball research that were inspired by what was going on in the public sphere at the time. So I say, you know, how I came to be in baseball was I decided that the the academic options that I was going to have were not going to be ones that I wanted to pursue. Actually, it was the Dodgers posted a job, and I looked at the application. I thought, I am not qualified to do that, and nobody's going to hire me unless I can, you know, show them that I know how to do it. And so, yeah, I started. I mean, I had already been spending a lot of time reading what was going on in the public baseball research sphere, and just thinking about like what are things that I think are interesting questions, right? Like what's a different version of the research design for this question that the public has provided an answer to? And I
Yeah,
just, you know, I built a little portfolio, and that was ultimately what got me interviews.
I love that. It's interesting because we get asked a lot for courses we have is, you know, what's the best way to showcase my work? And so it's nice to hear that portfolio, standard GitHub repos are still a way for, you know, to make that signal to the job market.
Yeah, I mean, and within baseball or sports especially, there are these very vibrant online communities of hobbyists, and
Not
yeah,
Reddit.
I mean, Reddit too. Yeah, I mean, a friend of mine actually who works for a football team, he posted research on Reddit for
Oh,
and
wow.
that's what got him noticed. Someone reached out from a team. So I mean, if you can get your hands on data and perform original research, there's a good chance someone's going to be interested in it. There's also a lot of, you know, there's a lot of contests now, like the Big Data Bowl for the NFL is, that's probably the most fertile recruiting ground for NFL analytics talent. Um, so yeah, those kinds of yeah, passion projects. Like do you like doing this stuff? And you know, are you willing to dig in and try to say something creative?
Yeah. Okay, so talking about, we'll kind of move this from tools to get ready for industry versus tools that you're seeing. So machine learning hype, AI hype, Gen AI hype, whatever you want to call it, is
Mhm.
absolutely everywhere. And you know, if you haven't heard it, you've been living under a rock. Is ML, let's kind of classify this into transformer-based generative AI
Mhm.
versus traditional machine learning models like LogReg, XGBoost, you know, some of the stuff that we deploy, say, pre-2018. What's moving the needle? Is it more of the traditional ML side, or are you starting to see any kind of infusion of a generative AI capability in the clubhouse?
Yeah, I think we are starting to see a movement towards things that are a lot closer to Gen AI. some of that is in the large language model space, but some of that is just in trying to get a handle on some of the data sources that I've described, where we've got this very complex spatio-temporal data. We're once you're in that world, you're in a world where it's hard for models that were built with just purely tabular data in mind to perform the way you want them to
And you
perform.
said the data source of that is mainly proprietary, correct?
We actually do get it from MLB at the major league level, and then
Mm,
teams have to purchase it at the minor league levels, and then there
okay.
are varying levels of it that you can purchase. Um, so yeah, I mean, there's certainly still places where we're getting a lot of value out of, your standard kind of machine learning, like whether it's some form of regularized regression, whether it's, tree-based models, whether it's kind of standard neural nets. Those are all over the place, but we're sort of the new and really interesting data sets we're getting are not just nice tabular data sets that you can, look at in Excel if you wanted to. So the tooling has to move along with it.
One last question, official, we'll call it official question before we start hitting some of the Q&As. Um, if hypothetically, if the MLB said all statistics are banned, but each club gets one stat and it's the only metric that you get to drive, which metric are you fighting for?
Oh man.
And you can cheat. It can be a combination. So we'll say we can do some feature engineering. It can be a combination of different stats to make one big stat or something like
Yeah, I mean, ideally, I would like whatever the all-in stat is. It kind of depends on which job I'm trying to do, right? If I'm trying to evaluate players, then I want the all-in measure of player value, which is going to be some amalgamation for fielders of, whatever I think the best hitting metric is, whatever I think the best fielding metric is. Um, so yeah, I will cheat there. I will say that I think that you could probably do a pretty good job piecing together, say, projections, like a forecast
that.
for a pitcher with things that you see in the public, like if you know a guy's walk rate and you have something like what gets called a stuff plus model, which is essentially something that grades out just the raw movement of a pitch. You could do a pretty good job picking pitchers. So I don't know if I can get it down to one without cheating and saying it's going to be a Frankenstein metric, but I think you can get down to a pretty limited set of things and be making like pretty good decisions.
Yeah. The more Frankenstein element to it, the more feature engineering and the more base features you have to kind of weed your way in there. All
Yeah.
right. So one of the questions I've got on the board is you mentioned stats have to be shared. So shared with other clubs, I'm assuming. But are there other teams developing custom platforms? This could be AI or ML. And do they have to share it? So, okay. So if I'm interpreting this right, is if you create a custom platform and it's like it has a nice UI, do you need to share that final product with another clubhouse or do you keep that internal?
No, it's just the data itself that gets shared. There's nothing that you build on top of it that has to be
Hmm.
shared.
So just baseline data for that sharing principle.
Yeah, but hypothetically, if we were to, let's say we were building a hardware internally to collect some source of data that we're not currently collecting, I don't think we would have to share that with anybody.
So hypothetically, you partner with someone like Databricks, you have a great distributed workload that brings in lots of different sources at the same time. You don't have to share that, but you do have to share this data itself.
Right. Or if we had I don't know, if we were flying drones over the stadium all the time as like a secondary source of player location data. I don't think we would have to share that, but like that's an area where the baseball is just kind of figuring it out as we go along, right?
Mm,
Where it used to be that we didn't have to share all of this, and teams were finding kind of clever ways to collect data that didn't need to be shared.
mm.
And teams would trade data sources. You'd say like, "Hey, I've got a couple of years of NCAA TrackMan. Do you want to trade that for some Dominican League data or some Korean League data?" And that fortunately has gone away because I never knew how to value those trades.
It's just like trading cards in elementary school, it just never
Yeah.
goes away. All right, another question. All right, looking 5 years out, What new data stream or technology are you most excited or nervous about?
Yeah, it's getting increasingly hard to think about what else we can collect on a Major League Baseball field. I think, we've got this amazing mechanical data for batters and pitchers, and I guess we could continue to collect data on what different parts of their body are doing. Like I do think it would be cool if we knew um, how, say, pitchers were applying pressure to the ball. Like if you had a really good
Mm,
sense of what a pitcher's fingers were doing, that's probably valuable information about their ability to manipulate a pitch, or it would be good for coaching feedback. Like, hey, your index finger left the ball too early. Um, I don't think we're all that close to that. That's just a really hard problem to be that precise. I think what I'm excited and nervous about, because it creates more data, and
yeah.
more data is both beneficial and problematic. It's just we're going to get more of this going down into lower levels, right? We're going to be like high school showcases are going to have full biomechanical data. Teams are going to set up things in the Dominican Republic to collect this kind of data, and we're just going to get more and more of it. And if if it starts to work its way down into NCAA, like the volume gets extraordinary, right? Like
Yeah.
there's only 30 MLB teams generating data on any given night. There are a lot more college teams generating
So
that data.
if any of the labs at Caltech are listening, I think those are some free points to some potential funding requests
Hmm.
to think of. All right, last participant question. What's the biggest misconception for Moneyball?
Um, I don't know if it was a big misconception then. I don't, things are not nearly as antagonistic as Moneyball made it seem. I'm sure at one point it was very antagonistic. But I think as the data has gotten better and as the data has gotten closer to the way that players and coaches experience baseball, um, we agree a lot more often than Moneyball would lead you to believe, right? Once you start collecting data on how a pitch is moving, it's one thing to say like I think batting average is overrated because it doesn't correlate as well with team runs scored. It's another thing entirely to say, um, you know, it matters like how many inches of vertical and horizontal break your curveball has and how fast it's
Mm.
going. Like everybody just fundamentally recognizes that that's true, and it creates a lot more opportunities for collaboration and agreement. So yeah, we are not we have a good relationship with our scouts. We have a good relationship with our coaches. It's very collegial.
So, what you're saying, easy to argue on philosophy, hard to argue on physics.
I think that's a fair way to put it.
One of our participants says it's hard to measure the heart and the will of a player, and I think maybe that falls into the same category.
Yes, I think that falls into the things that I recognize are important and am in no position to opine on.
Mm,
And that's a big part of what comes together, or how we come together to make a decision at the trade deadline, right? What
yeah,
are the things that we are not recognizing, uh, that we're not accounting for in our models that we really need to think about? Like, is this guy just an exceptional competitor? Is this person a great teammate? Is this person willing to take a role that is not, what they're used to? Like those kinds of questions for how someone slots into our team are, yeah, I will
yeah.
concede, extremely important, and I have very little ability to to give an informed answer one way or another.
Well, Dr. Anderson, I'm going to give you a brief moment. If you have any roles that you are looking for, or if you want to kind of, I know we've got a lot of folks who are in the analytics and the engineering space. Feel free to share with the group.
Yeah, we're actually just about to post a position for kind of early mid-career data scientist. I'm hoping the post goes up this week, but we list kind of two technical tracks that we're especially interested. One is experience working with spatiotemporal data. So, I mentioned what that looks like in baseball, but people who are working with any kind of wearables or sensor data, or people who've worked on, I don't know, autonomous vehicles, like anything where you are collecting a bunch of different data points in space and time and having to reconcile all of those. That's a skill set we're really interested in. If anyone has experience there, we would love to talk. And the other part is Bayesian statistics. We're always looking for people who can build um, uh, good generative models of how kind of baseball data emerges and then build those up to kind of decision-making products. And those are aimed at, people who are maybe a couple of years out of undergraduate or people who are just finishing a grad program. If you do not meet that description and you think you have some of those skills that I mentioned, I'd just love to talk to people anyways. We are always trying to be opportunistic and just find smart people who love baseball and want to help us win championships.
Excellent. Well, this sounds like a perfect marriage of a science and technology and baseball podcast here. If someone wants to get a hold of you, be it for future research, be it for job opportunities, or maybe they are a researcher in a lab and want to move over to baseball, how can they get a hold of you?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn. My DMs are open. You can also email me at richarda@ladodgers.com.
Excellent. Looks like Stacy popped that right into the chat thread.
Great.
Dr. Anderson, thank you so much for your time. We're very excited to continue watching the success of the LA Dodgers as a fellow Los Angelesian. I couldn't be happier to have you on the podcast.
Oh, thank you. It was a lot of fun.
All right. Talk to you later. Thanks,
All right.
everybody.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.